She raised him like her own, gave him everything, and he repaid her by kicking her to the curb. It was a Tuesday evening, one of those dusky hours when the sky can't decide between sunset and storm. Margaret stood on the porch in her worn slippers, holding a cloth tote with a half-eaten baguette, 3 cans of lentils, and a rotisserie chicken warming the bag through its thin lining. She leaned into the front door, her front door, and immediately sensed something was off. The key wouldn't turn. She jiggled it, tried different angles, even flipped it upside down, as if the problem was just muscle memory failing her. But it wasn't her hands that were mistaken. It was the lock. Someone had changed the deadbolt. She knocked once, then again, then harder, her knuckles thudding against the wood while still clutching her bag, still wrapped in her pale green cardigan that smelled faintly of lilacs, still standing on the porch she'd stepped onto for over 2 decades. The door opened, just a sliver. Vanessa, Carter's girlfriend, peeked through with a surprised expression, as if Margaret were a delivery she hadn't ordered. "Oh, hi. Weren't you supposed to be at the church until later?" Margaret frowned. "Why can't I unlock my door?" Vanessa glanced back, then stepped onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. "I think Carter was going to talk to you." "About what?" Margaret asked. "You don't live here anymore?" The silence was dense. Margaret clutched the tote tighter, suddenly unsure where to rest her arms. Her chest squeezed. "What did you just say?" Vanessa gave a forced smile, the kind people wear when they're trying to keep chaos polite. "It's just legal stuff, really. Carter said you were okay with transferring the house over. Remember? All those forms on the dining table?" Margaret stared. Slowly, it began to add up. The stack of documents. Carter's casual tone when she'd asked what it all meant. "Just protocol," he'd said. "Just making sure everything's set in case anything happens." She had believed him. She had believed her son. And now, her fingers were trembling. Vanessa didn't linger. She slipped back inside, mumbling something about calling Carter. The door shut behind her, then locked. Margaret stood still. 1 minute, 3, then 7. No one came back. And she didn't knock again. She stepped down from the porch slowly, the warm chicken tucked under her elbow like something fragile. She had no idea where her feet would take her, but she knew one thing. They weren't taking her back there, because Carter hadn't just stolen her home. He had taken something deeper. And Margaret was about to remember exactly who she was. Long before Vanessa, before the signatures, before the lock turned against her, she had been more than just a woman keeping a house. She had been a mother, and not just to anyone, but to a boy no one else had wanted. Back in 1997, Margaret was pulling long nights at Mercy General Hospital in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She was a night shift RN, resilient, calm under pressure, and gently spoken. A woman who had long made peace with the idea that motherhood wouldn't be in the cards. After 2 painful miscarriages and a failed fertility treatment, the ache was buried deep, unseen, but never forgotten. Then one evening, she met Caleb. He'd been brought in with a fractured arm, barely 3 years old, pale and thin, wearing a stretched-out sweatshirt that hung off his frame, its sleeves covered in ketchup. His foster parent didn't stay, just handed him over to a caseworker and walked out without a word. Margaret hadn't been planning to adopt, but sometimes life doesn't ask permission. Sometimes it just places a child in your care and dares you to walk away. Caleb didn't speak for days. He just wrapped his tiny arms around her like he was holding on for dear life. Wouldn't say a word, wouldn't eat unless it was from her hand. Something in her calmed him, and that was all the reason she needed. Just 9 weeks later, she submitted the first adoption forms. Half a year after that, he shared her last name. Her colleagues thought she'd lost her mind. A single black woman in her late 30s adopting a white boy with trauma in his eyes. Trying to fix the whole foster care system, they joked. No, she'd say, just him. Margaret gave Caleb everything she wished someone had given her. A bedroom with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, sandwiches with his name written in hearts, violin lessons, soccer camp, weekend drives to the nature preserve. He had allergies. She found the top pediatric allergist in the city, struggled with spelling. She got him a reading coach. She even taught him how to braid by practicing on his superhero dolls so he'd be ready to care for a daughter one day. Every holiday card had his handwriting. Every teacher conference, she was there, front row, pen in hand. But love wasn't always enough. As Caleb got older, things started to shift. By junior high, the questions began. Why don't we look the same? Why do people keep staring at us in public? Are you really my mom? She always answered with truth. Yes, you're adopted, but that doesn't make you any less mine. Still, it never truly settled for him. In high school, he pulled away. By the time college came, his visits were rare and brief. A quick overnight stay, a takeout dinner. Hey, Ma, and then gone again, eyes glued to his phone. Margaret never pushed. She kept his room the same, lights on, hoping quiet love would be loud enough one day. Then her husband died. And suddenly, Caleb started visiting more often. At first, it felt like a blessing. He'd clear out gutters, rake leaves, even refill her pill organizer without her asking. Sometimes he brought his girlfriend Amanda, and they'd chat on the porch while Margaret baked cornbread and watched Jeopardy. She believed things were mending. What she didn't know was that Caleb hadn't returned to reconnect. He had come back to assess. And by the time she pieced it all together, the house was no longer in her name, and her years of trust had been traded for nothing. But a mother never forgets, and Margaret was already reliving every sacrifice she'd ever made. That night, she slept in her car. She parked it 3 blocks from the place she once called home, outside a row of worn-down duplexes with rusted railings and plastic lawn chairs that hadn't moved in years. She didn't cry, not once, but her hands stayed fixed on the steering wheel, frozen at 10 and 2, long after the engine went silent. The rotisserie chicken sat untouched in the passenger seat, now cold, its juices leaking through the container. She stared through the windshield, not at anything in particular, just through it. Grief doesn't always come from losing people. Sometimes it's the realization that they were never who you thought they were. When her husband Thomas passed away 4 years ago due to an undiagnosed embolism, Margaret thought nothing could hurt worse. He had been her anchor, quiet, deliberate, full of depth. They met through a church book club, fell in love over catfish dinners and late-night gospel talks, and spent nearly 30 years building a life grounded in faith, grace, and consistency. But this pain, this betrayal, cut differently. The next morning, Margaret walked into the bank. Out of routine, partly, but mostly instinct. And there it was, almost ironic. The balance hadn't moved. Caleb never touched it, because Caleb never even knew it existed. After Thomas died, the hospital tried to dodge responsibility, called it an unfortunate event, but Margaret had been in nursing long enough to know when someone was stalling. She pressed, filed the right paperwork, looped in a retired legal contact from her nursing days, and 2 years later, she won a malpractice case everyone had told her was a lost cause. The settlement? Just over $8.7 million. She didn't tell a soul, not even Caleb. She shifted it into a protected trust under her maiden name, spread it across several institutions. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Not secrecy, strategy, because money changes people, and some treasures are safer left in silence. That morning, sitting in that padded bank chair with her ankles swollen and her heart splintered in 2, Margaret came to a quiet truth. Caleb hadn't just broken her trust. He'd misjudged her entirely. The house might have been gone, but she wasn't. She still had experience. She still had options. And she had something her son never learned to value: patience. That same day, she paid cash for a motel off the interstate in Hattiesburg. 2 nights, no ID, no questions. He needed a strategy, but more than that, she needed stillness. A moment to breathe and remember exactly who she was. Sitting in that motel room, Margaret pulled out an old spiral-bound notebook from her purse, pages filled with prayers, contact numbers, and little reminders to call her aunt in Shreveport. Near the back, she found a note she'd jotted down years ago, the day her settlement cleared. Let money make you silent, not loud. Let it buy you space. Let it buy you time. She smiled faintly. Caleb thought he'd pushed her out, but really, he had no idea. He hadn't exiled her. He'd released her. But freedom doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. Not at first. Margaret still had some fires left to walk through before she'd rise again. She could still remember the first time Caleb dropped a folder in front of her. It was a Sunday. She'd been at the kitchen table folding towels while the oven ticked steadily, warming up a pecan pie. Her joints ached that day, the kind of ache that whispered rain was on the way, but she'd kept her smile. Caleb had shown up unannounced. She didn't love surprises, but told herself maybe it meant he missed her. He walked in wearing one of those slim-fit shirts that looked like it came from a catalog, like he was trying on someone else's life. Amanda followed right behind, eyes stuck to her phone screen. Hey, Ma, Caleb said, leaning down for a half-hearted hug. Brought some papers. It's no big deal. Just stuff to clean up taxes, tighten things up on the property side, back-end kind of stuff, you know? Margaret's brow creased. What kind of papers? Caleb opened a folder with a smooth flick, like a card trick. Trust documents, property transfers, power of attorney forms. We had them reviewed. Amanda's office handles this stuff all the time. Totally normal. Amanda, still scrolling, mumbled, It's just to protect your assets, Mrs. Ellis. It keeps everything in your name but avoids probate later. I didn't ask to avoid anything, Margaret said, soft but steady, her palms pressed gently against a half-folded dish towel. Caleb gave a short laugh. I know. That's why we're helping. Look, if something happened to you, God forbid, it'd be chaos trying to untangle everything. This just makes sure the house stays in the family. Margaret looked down, the words on the page blurred slightly. She didn't wear her reading glasses much, hated the way they pinched the bridge of her nose. Caleb noticed. Here, he said, offering her a pen. I already marked the signature spots. No need to worry about the rest. I've gone through it all with them. She hesitated. There were things she wanted to say. Things like, maybe I should have someone check this. Or, why do you need power of attorney now? But the words caught in her throat. This was her son, her baby. The boy who once cried when she left the room, who couldn't sleep without her hand resting on his chest when he was sick. The child she'd sat beside through late-night asthma attacks, rubbing his back with one hand and holding a humidifier steady with the other. So she signed, page after page. Caleb even cracked a joke while she scribbled her name like it was all just routine. You're making history, Ma. Margaret let out a small laugh, barely more than a breath. The timer beeped for the pie, and she rose slowly to shut off the oven. That moment lingered in her memory for weeks afterward, the scent of cinnamon crust and caramelized sugar in the air, the soft click of a pen cap closing, and Amanda's smile that stretched just a little too wide, a little too pleased. At the time, she didn't know it, but that afternoon would be the last time she'd ever sit at her own kitchen table. The visits changed after that. Caleb stopped coming around to catch up. Now he arrived with bank printouts and smooth-talking friends who tossed around phrases like return on investment and market movement. He was always pacing, always pitching some property deal or bragging about building a portfolio. Suddenly, her home wasn't a home anymore. It was equity waiting to be unlocked. And then came something new. He started calling her Margaret in front of Amanda. Not Mom, not Mama, just Margaret. Then one afternoon, while she was watering the begonias out front, she caught Amanda on a call saying, once we close on this place, we can finally lock in that loft in Austin. That's when Margaret started quietly packing a small overnight bag just in case. She placed her Bible inside, along with her passport, the last photo she had of Thomas, and her worn notebook that held the account details of the settlement Caleb never knew about. Her body had slowed with age, but her instincts, still sharp enough to sense when affection had turned transactional. Margaret hadn't survived everything she had just to stand by and watch her life be erased. Not without showing Caleb exactly what name he had written over when he started treating her like a burden. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon. She'd just finished vacuuming the den, something she still liked to do herself, even though her knees ached with every step. Dust didn't care how old you were. And Margaret believed a clean house was a reflection of dignity, whether anyone noticed or not. Caleb walked in, still wearing his sunglasses indoors, earbuds draped around his collar. Amanda followed, mid-sentence on a Bluetooth call, barely looking up. They didn't acknowledge her at first, just passed by like she was part of the furniture, or worse, the help. Then Caleb paused, turned casually and said, Hey, next time you use the Dyson, can you remember to empty it? We've got folks coming to check out the place this weekend. Margaret blinked. Folks? Realtors, he said, just to get a sense of the market. You know, early stages. You're selling the house? He laughed, like she'd asked something absurd. Not yet, just weighing options. Gotta be forward-thinking, right? She straightened her back. Our options? And that's when he said it. You're kind of a guest now, Ma. It's still your space, of course. But legally, well, you know how these things go. Her fingers gripped the vacuum handle a little tighter. She didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't shed a tear. She just nodded once. That night, she packed the bag for real. She didn't take much. Just what mattered. That Bible, the notebook, 2 dresses, a pair of sneakers, and her wedding band, the one she hadn't worn since Thomas passed, but still kept in a tiny velvet pouch beside her bed. Caleb didn't ask where she was headed. Amanda didn't even look up. As far as they were concerned, they had everything they came for, or so they thought. Margaret checked into a modest motel on the edge of town, right near a 24-hour gas station with flickering overheads and a diner that smelled like burnt coffee. The bed squeaked when she sat down. The radiator wheezed like an old man with a cold, but it was hers, and it was quiet. She pulled out her notebook and sat at the tiny desk. Then she opened it. There was a number scribbled near the back of her notebook, one she'd held onto for nearly 15 years. It belonged to a woman named Janice, who used to work at a nonprofit that helped senior women navigate tenant rights and property laws. Janice had come through for her once, years back, when a renter tried to blame her for a water heater leak. Margaret tapped the number into her phone. One ring, two. Disconnected. She sighed and shut her eyes for a moment. Then another name surfaced, Clarence James Burrell, or just CJ, one of Thomas's old friends from the neighborhood. A lawyer, long retired, ornery as ever, but brilliant and loyal. They hadn't spoken in a long time, but Margaret picked up the phone anyway. It rang 6 times before someone finally answered. A scratchy, worn voice came through. "This better be Jesus or a mess." Margaret smiled. "Maybe it's a little of both." A pause. "Maggie?" "Yeah, it's me. I need a favor. I need to talk." CJ didn't need a lot of persuading. Real friends remember who showed up after the funeral, who dropped off food after your hip surgery, who kept showing up even when it wasn't convenient. And CJ had been waiting for this call. He just didn't know when it would come. The next morning, they met at a roadside diner just off Highway 49. The kind with laminated menus, chipped coffee mugs, and waitresses who called everyone sweetheart, whether they were toddlers or war veterans. CJ looked older now. His beard was more salt than pepper, and his eyes carried the weight of the years. But the brow was still furrowed, and his voice still cut like a knife. "You look like 10 miles of bad road," he said as he slid into the booth across from her. Margaret gave a dry smile. "Morning to you too." He took a sip from his black coffee. No sugar, no cream. Just like Thomas used to drink it. "All right," he said, setting the cup down with a clink. "Start from the beginning. No sugarcoating. Just give it to me straight." So she did. She told him about the paperwork Caleb had handed her, the locks, the way Amanda smiled like it was all already hers, the way he started calling her Margaret instead of Ma, the agents, the hollow pleasantries. CJ didn't interrupt once, just sat back, arms folded, listening with that stillness only old lawyers and pastors seemed to master. When she finally stopped, he exhaled long and slow. "He played you, no doubt, but he made one fatal mistake." She looked at him. "What mistake?" "He forgot who raised him." Margaret stared at her napkin, fingers tracing the stitching at the edge. "But I signed it over, CJ, the deed. I wrote my name on every page." He nodded. "Yeah, but if he misrepresented the documents, if he manipulated or withheld what it really meant, that's not legally binding. Consent given under false pretenses can be challenged." "You really think we can take this to court?" CJ gave her a sideways grin. "Maggie, I could file a motion against him in my pajamas and still win." She let out a tired laugh. It didn't carry much joy, but it did lift some weight. "I'm just worn out, CJ. I'm not trying to ruin him. I just want my house back. And I want to be able to look in the mirror and not feel like a fool." He nodded slowly, serious again. "Then we won't ruin him. We'll teach him a lesson he won't forget." They sat in that booth for over 2 hours, hashing it all out. Every signature, every date she remembered, conversations she jotted down. Margaret had documented more than she even realized. Nurse habits die hard. Always write it down. Always cover yourself. CJ walked her through what to expect next, the type of legal counsel he'd connect her with, the process of petitioning for review of the property transfer, what could happen if it reached court. Then, just as their plates were cleared and coffee mugs refilled, Margaret looked up and said something she hadn't told another soul. "I've got money, CJ." He blinked. "You mean some tucked away in savings?" "No," she said calmly. "I mean real money. A settlement from the hospital, just under $9 million. CJ almost dropped his coffee. "Lord have mercy." "I never touched it," Margaret continued. "Didn't want Caleb to know. Didn't really want anyone to know." CJ sat back slowly, shaking his head. "You've been sitting on that kind of money and letting that boy run you in circles?" "I didn't want the money to change how I loved him," she whispered. CJ didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, really looked at her, then reached across the worn table and laid his hand on hers. "It didn't," he said quietly. "He changed all on his own." Margaret turned to the window beside their booth. Beyond the smudged glass, the highway shimmered under late morning light. Her reflection stared back at her, older than she felt, weathered, but not defeated. She looked like something chipped, not shattered. She turned back to CJ. "I want to do this the right way. No noise, no headlines, just my name back on my mailbox." CJ gave her a firm nod. "Then we'll make that happen." But there was still one thing left before attorneys, filings, and hearings. One last conversation she had to try. Not with the man Caleb had become, but with the boy she once cradled. She didn't call ahead. She knew if she did, he'd ignore the call or let Amanda speak for him. So she drove there instead. It was late afternoon when she pulled into the driveway. The yard looked like a real estate listing, manicured just enough to impress buyers, but too sterile to feel like home. Her flower beds were gone. She knocked once. Caleb answered in basketball shorts and a performance hoodie, clutching a protein shake. His face stiffened the moment he saw her. Margaret, what are you doing here?" She stepped forward, just enough to be separated by the screen door. "I won't stay long. I just need a minute." He glanced over his shoulder, probably checking if Amanda was nearby, then let out a sigh and stepped out onto the porch. "Look, if this is about the house—" She lifted her hand. "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "I raised you when nobody else would, not out of duty, and not for praise, but because I saw a child who needed something real, and I gave it everything I had." His eyes darted briefly, but he stayed silent. "I watched you grow. I gave up sleep, health, holidays. I gave you my youth, my strength, my peace, and never once made you feel like an outsider in this life." Her voice caught just slightly. "And you repaid that with a signature and a new lock." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "You signed, Ma. It's not like I—" "Don't call me that," she said sharply. "Not if you don't mean it." Silence fell between them. She straightened her spine. "I'm not here to fight, just to tell you what you need to know." She looked him dead in the eye. "I know what you did, and you need to know something too. I was never broke. Not once. I've had enough money to buy this house 10 times over." His expression shifted. First disbelief, then confusion, and finally a flicker of shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "You weren't meant to know," she replied, "because love isn't a transaction, and trust doesn't come with a price tag. But now I know who you are, and now so do you." He opened his mouth, but no words came. "I've already spoken to legal counsel," Margaret said calmly. "This will go where it needs to go, but I needed to see your face one more time before it does." Caleb's arm fell limp at his side. "You're taking me to court?" "No," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'm going to remind you what a real home costs." And with that, she turned, walked back to her car. No shouting, no pleas. Just a woman who had finally remembered what she was worth. People like Margaret aren't afraid of courtrooms. What unsettles men like Caleb is when the person they underestimated refuses to crumble. 3 months later, the house stood vacant. No couch, no Amanda, no Caleb. The new owner, a retired librarian from Baton Rouge, said the place felt heavy the moment she stepped through the door, like it had survived something invisible but immense. And it had. CJ had wasted no time. The fraud petition was processed faster than anyone expected. The judge barely paused after reviewing the evidence, ruling that Margaret had clearly been manipulated and misinformed, and that the transfer was not just questionable, but likely exploitative. Caleb didn't bother showing up to the hearing. He had already skipped town. Amanda returned to Austin alone. When Margaret heard, she didn't grin, didn't gloat. She just let out a breath she'd been holding for months, slow and full, as if something deep inside her had finally exhaled. But she didn't move back into the house. Too much memory. Too many quiet stings and old dinners that now felt like scenes in a play she hadn't known she was in. Instead, she took her money, untouched, unspoken of hers, and did something no one saw coming. She bought 3 modest homes in Ocean Springs. Not big, not flashy, just enough. She turned them into transitional housing for women over 60 who'd been pushed out, forgotten, or left behind by the very people they once raised. She called the project Thomas House, in honor of her late husband, the kind of man who would have spent his retirement building something like this if he'd gotten the chance. The first resident was Irene, 75, evicted by her grandson when she said she couldn't help with childcare anymore. The second was Marla, whose daughter sold her condo while she was recovering from back surgery. Every Sunday, Margaret cooked for them. Some days they shared meals and watched quiz shows. Other days, they just sat on the porch, trading stories about who broke them and how they lived to tell it. Margaret never needed to explain her story. The strength was in how she moved now, calm, clear, unapologetic. CJ still dropped by sometimes, especially when legal documents started stacking up. He liked to tease her. "One of these days I'm putting your face on a billboard," he'd say. The woman who turned betrayal into a blueprint. Margaret would just laugh and shake her head, waving him off like it wasn't a big deal, but everyone around her knew it was. "I just did what my mama always said. When you're backed into a corner, you don't panic. You pray, plant your feet, and guard your peace." But Margaret knew this battle had never truly been about a house. It was about refusing to let one act of betrayal rewrite a lifetime built with grit and grace. 1 year later, Margaret sat on the back porch of Thomas' house with a warm cup of chamomile tea in hand and a soft blanket draped over her lap. The sunset over Ocean Springs painted the sky in swirls of amber and tangerine. One of those dusks that made silence feel sacred. Irene was upstairs, working on a quilt. Marla was in the kitchen, quietly singing an old hymn as she washed fresh greens. And Margaret, for the first time in a long while, just was. Not anxious, not bitter, not broken, just still. That morning she'd received a letter, no return address, just her name, handwritten in a script she hadn't seen in nearly 12 months. Inside, a note. I made a mistake. I see it now. I don't know why I handled things the way I did. Maybe I thought you owed me something. Maybe I never fully grasped what you gave. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed to say this. You didn't deserve what I did. I hope you're doing okay. Caleb Margaret read it once, then again. She folded the paper with care and slipped it into the back of her Bible, not because she intended to forget, but because some wounds are meant to be acknowledged, not reopened. She didn't write back. She didn't have to. To Margaret, forgiveness was never about letting someone off easy. It was about releasing yourself from the weight of what they did. And now she understood something she hadn't before. You can love someone completely, raise them with patience, sacrifice everything, and still lose them, not because you failed, but because of who they chose to become. And that's not a burden you carry. That's not your fault to fix. As the crickets began their evening chorus, Margaret leaned back, letting her head rest against the chair. She closed her eyes and drew a breath, not the kind that fills lungs, but the kind that fills space, that fills memory, that fills meaning. A house had walls, a home had heart, and she had built a new one, brick by quiet brick, no deed required. If this story reached somewhere deep inside you, if it reminded you of someone you've lost, loved, or had to let go, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because real love doesn't vanish, real mothers don't fold, and real strength doesn't shout. It rebuilds, quietly, faithfully, from the ground up.